Hi, this is State Delegate Janelle Wilkins from District 20 in Montgomery County, and you're listening to the Conduit Street Podcast, the best source of news and notes on Maryland politics and policy. The Conduit Street Podcast, the official podcast of the Maryland Association of Counties.
And welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. Kevin Kinnally here with Michael Sanderson. Michael, it's after dark. It's Thursday night, pretty typical, but we are excited this week because we have a very special guest.
Yeah, this is good stuff. We're semi-remote. It's a little bit weird, and semi after dark. But yeah, the guest makes this worthwhile. So let's hit it.
We have with us Majority Leader, the Maryland House of Delegates, Delegate Eric Luedtke. Delegate Luedtke, thank you so much for joining us. I know that we have a lot of Twitter banter back and forth and whatnot, but I know that you're a friend of the podcast. You have some intros floating around that we use. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. We have a lot to talk about.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. And yeah, I'm a big fan of the podcast. I listen all the time. And also, before we get to anything else, I want to clarify that when I make fun of Michael Sanderson for his dad jokes, I consider that a compliment. I am myself a big proponent of dad jokes. So I apologize if I ever, made him feel insulted, but it's a compliment.
Oh, I don't know if I totally buy that. Like you thought this was going to be like, come on the podcast, and this is going to be some sort of 8 Mile throwdown, joke off sort of thing. That's not the show. You're a policy guy. We're delighted that you listen to the pod and are a friend of the pod, and this has been a long time coming. So we're really glad to have you aboard.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so we'll get into a bunch of topics. We'll talk tax policy. We'll talk some environment stuff and parks and schools, all the stuff that you deal with every single day, Delegate Luedtke and the Ways and Means Committee. But first of all, we mentioned you are the majority leader. So what does that actually mean? Does that mean you just have like a nice big office and you got an upgrade there? But what is majority leader? What is your duty there?
Well, I mean, under the rules, the only real job I have is to adjourn the session every day. But, I think the best way to describe it is I'm kind of a minister without portfolio. I have my fingers in whatever pies the speaker tells me to. Under the current speaker, who's been great about giving me the opportunity to learn new things and do new things. I do a lot of press work, a lot of work on our different initiatives out of the Democratic caucus, and I help manage our floor debate to make sure that goes well.
And caucus work is, I think, in my judgment, it's an underappreciated part of the political process in a large body, like the House of Delegates, right? You got 141 members in the House, and you've got two different parties represented. And independent of what the split is among the parties, the idea of joining with members of your party and talking about, we want to do this first and we'll save this one for later, but when this thing comes up, everybody should be on the same page. That's part of what makes a large body like that work effectively. I think like you can take your 9th grade civics class and you read about the pure democracy and all these sorts of things, but making a large organization work smoothly requires a team of people in leadership. And part of it is through the party structure. And that's just, that's the way it works down the road in DC to some degree. Sometimes it doesn't always work there. But in Annapolis, I think it's a big part of the show. So you're a player in lots of things. We appreciate having you here, talk about all that stuff, but might as well get it out of the way. Majority leader, kind of a big deal in Annapolis.
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, mostly I see myself as helping out my members. That's a lot of it, helping them coordinate, helping them organize, and helping the speaker get her work done. So it's been quite an honor to fill that role.
I mean, and oftentimes, you mentioned managing the floor debate, but you're often getting up in the middle of intense debates and having to kind of reset the tone, right? And reset the debate, reframe things. That's also a big part of this. I see you doing that a lot. So I would assume that's something that you probably enjoy it anyway. You like to get up and debate, but a lot of that is sort of just calming things down, reframing things, resetting, pressing the restart button, right? And that's often what I hear you and see you doing on the floor.
Yeah, and I mean, in all honesty, it's not just me. It's the minority leader as well, does the same thing. Our former minority leader, Nick Kipke, our current one, Jason Buckle. And it's one of the reasons that sort of commitment to reason, debate, and calming down some of the rhetoric is one of the reasons we haven't seen the same level of vitriol in Annapolis that we see in Washington, D.C. right now. And I think it's been good for us as a state.
Yeah, hats off for that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So now that that's out of the way, we know you have a nicer office too. So anyway, we won't get into that. But let's talk about tax policy. I know it's one of your favorite topics. You deal with it every day on the Ways and Means Committee. We are heavily invested in tax policy at the local county level, but obviously there's a lot of important stuff going on at the state level as well. And I think one of the first topics to get into, the balance with state tax incentives, right? State and local incentives. This is a conversation that you could talk hours and hours and hours about. Everybody has a different opinion on, giveaways versus incentives. Do they work? This is for energy, business, et cetera. And it seems like we have that debate every single year. There are certainly bills every year that want to give an incentive to someone, whether or not that's income tax or, property tax, all the gambit of taxes. So let's talk about that generally. I mean, what is your general stance, Delegate, on incentives? Let's, I guess, focus on business first, right? Is it to you, like, do you want the receipts? Do you want to make sure these are working? I mean, where do you draw the line? Because it's always a fascinating debate in Ways and Means when we talk about things like the enterprise zone program or more jobs for Marylanders. These are designed to draw businesses to Maryland, and there are some upsides there, but there's also a cost. So what's your general, how do you draw that line?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think, folks who run a business, a publicly traded corporation, have a responsibility to their shareholders to get the best deal possible. I see my job with business incentives similarly. I have a responsibility to get the best deal for taxpayers possible. And that means trying to make sure that our business incentive programs are doing what they're supposed to do, that we're not just giving away money, that we're actually incenting new businesses to develop and grow and hire people. So we've made it a policy over the last few years to periodically sunset all of our major tax credit programs so that we get a chance to take a look, do an assessment. Is this still working? Do we want to change course? And I think that's been good for us as a state. We've worked hand in hand with the counties where it applies to the counties, with the business community, with lots of stakeholders. I think Maryland's in a better place now than it was a few years ago with the business incentives because of that attitude.
I think tax policy as a way to affect, whether it's social policy or whether to try and encourage or incent certain types of business or types of behavior, I think it's underappreciated in that regard. Like, I think everybody understands the idea of let's get some money in the budget for a new program to go do a thing. And every year there's a budget process, and boy, we want to get the money in the budget for the thing we support. But right across the hall is a committee that's talking about tax policy and the idea of let's change tax policy to try and encourage a certain kind of behavior, move people in a certain kind of direction, or bring businesses along in a direction we think is good for Maryland. I think it's an underappreciated part of getting stuff done and using fiscal policy as a way to get there. So, in the Senate, they have a lot of this stuff consolidated in one committee. The Ways and Means Committee, I think, is an underappreciated part of those fiscal decisions that are important, big picture.
Yeah, I agree. It's one of the reasons I really enjoy the work. If tax policy were just about how much money do we need for government and, how do we raise that, then that's a mathematical calculation. That's easy. But we do make a lot of those types of decisions. And it's not easy work. It's very technical work. We have fantastic staff in legislative services that's steeped in economics and statistics and law that helps us through it. But yeah, I think you're right. It's underappreciated. And honestly, most voters don't even know those conversations are happening. It really doesn't hit their radar screen necessarily.
Yeah, it's not the sexiest stuff that goes on in Annapolis. We get it, but it's I'm an old time Ways and Means guy. I was professional staff to the committee some years ago, and still carry a torch for the work of the Ways and Means Committee. So big believer.
Well, once a Ways and Meaner, always a Ways and Meaner. So you're still an honorary member of the committee.
I like it.
Yeah. So on another incentive, right? We talked about business, but something that's starting to blow up, and we know why. The state has committed to meeting certain goals when it comes to renewable energy. And so we're seeing a lot of these incentives, Delegate, being proposed for energy, right? So particularly this year, it looks like a lot of solar incentives. And a lot of that does come back to counties in terms of personal property tax, real property tax. Those are the drivers really for counties when it comes to income. And there are policy decisions that have to be made at the state level. Counties are always showing up saying, hey, let us make that decision locally. But when it comes to energy incentives, what do you think about that? I mean, this is really blowing up, particularly this year. I've seen a lot of these bills, not just for solar, but a lot of clean energy stuff. So what do you think about all the bills aimed at doing that? And obviously, again, it's for a reason. The state has to meet some of these goals when it comes to renewable energy.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's definitely a goal that we're seeking to reach, to expand access to clean energy, to expand energy production in the state. But as you say, it is a complex issue, and it affects a number of different types of taxes. On the the county side, the personal property and real property side, I think on any issue that impacts county budgets, we have a real responsibility as legislators to have those conversations with the counties, right? What is the impact? Is there a better way to do this? In a broader sense, I think we're going to continue to see these types of incentive bills introduced, and we've seen them introduced for years now. We have existing incentives related to solar and battery storage and all sorts of different things. There will come a point where our economy has transitioned, right? And where we really do have a clean energy economy. And we have to, at that point, be able to go back and say, hey, maybe we don't need these incentives anymore because they won't be serving that same purpose.
I think that's probably the smart way to do this stuff. And, along the way, there's going to be friction with stakeholders, like local governments and all that sort of stuff. But I think along the way, you're asking the right questions to say, are we creating incentives that are going to change behavior or just piggyback on existing behavior and end up rewarding stuff that was happening anyway? I don't know that you ever can find the absolute bullseye there, but I think the committee has to struggle with all those sorts of things. That's part of what makes tax policy interesting.
Absolutely.
No doubt. So while we're on the subject, Delegate, a few years ago, you put in a bill, and I think it was maybe to start a conversation, but I'll tell you, it certainly did. And we had the Ways and Means Committee was overflowing. I think your Facebook, your social media, you were getting a lot of comments, let's just put it that way. You were a big target for a lot of the business industry. You put in a bill that would have applied the sales tax in Maryland to most services. So we don't do that, right? But talk about that. Talk about what that was like. How did it feel to get all this vitriol thrown your way? And I know you can handle it, but what was the thought process behind that? And it was certainly a conversation starter, and was interesting to look at, the people who showed up, the fiscal note. What was the thought behind that? And how did it feel to, again, be target number one for a lot of people?
Yeah, look, I mean, I didn't run for office to only talk about easy things, right? Mm-hmm. And to take a step back, one of the big flaws in Maryland's tax structure is that we have a regressive tax system. And what that means is, working class and middle class Marylanders pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes than do the wealthiest Marylanders. Mm-hmm. The main reason for that is the sales tax, right? Because people that don't make as much money spend more of their household budget on stuff, on the things they need to live every day. And we tax those things through the sales tax. Wealthier people, their household budgets tend to have a lot more services, things we don't tax, right? So that contributes to this problem where we're essentially balancing our state budget more on the backs of people that can't afford it than on the backs of people that can. So, the proposal was to, at the same time, expand some of our taxation, the sales tax, to cover services, but also decrease the rate. So the sales taxes would have been going down on the stuff that people buy, but there would have been taxes now on the services that people buy. And, the vitriol, honestly, most of what I got was just people reaching out to say, hey, I don't like this idea. And that's democracy. That's how it's supposed to work, right? In the modern political climate, of course, you get people that say rude things on Facebook, and you learn as an elected official, and this is true of local elected officials too. You learn to brush it off. You learn that's just par for the course. But I thought it was a good conversation to have, and it, that broaching that conversation about the regressiveness of the sales tax led to us, among other factors, led to us developing some proposals we're pushing this year on the sales tax.
Right.
I think you got some of that kind of stuff queued up. And it seems like at least the House leadership and the folks you work closely with have some ideas about tax relief, sort of reading the room, right? Like we're in this peculiar economy. We've got inflation pressure, which is something most Marylanders haven't really been feeling for the most part. Some of it's at the gas pump, but it's like, day to day. What are you all thinking on that front? We've seen pieces of this start to get public, but what does House leadership have in mind that might come out of this session sort of for the circumstance Marylanders are in today?
Yeah, look, I mean, the speaker was very transparent on the first day of session. One of the first things she said is we're going to focus on pocketbooks. We're going to focus on working on middle-class Marylanders. And a number of the proposals, not just on the tax side, a number of our proposals this year have focused on that. So, for example, the attention we're paying to childcare and expanding access to childcare is an important part of that, because trust me, I've got kids. It's expensive. It's rough.
Yep.
So, we announced last week and actually passed out of the Ways and Means Committee as we're recording today a package of bills we're calling the Family Budget Boosters, because folks are telling us, the inflation's hitting their pocketbooks. There's a lot of folks still struggling. So essentially what we're doing with these bills is trying to expand sales tax exemptions for everyday items that people rely on, that they need. So, for the 600,000 Marylanders with diabetes, we're eliminating sales taxes on diabetes care products. We're eliminating sales taxes on diapers and on baby bottles and car seats. For older folks that need access to home medical equipment, we're eliminating sales taxes on things like pulse oximeters and blood pressure devices. And the goal is really to ease up some of that pressure on family budgets.
And I think that probably gets to the regressivity issue that you mentioned earlier as well. We know sales tax as a matter of public policy has a weakness that it tends to fall on people who are more, hand to mouth, sort of like, paycheck to paycheck. And we make exemptions from the sales tax for things like buying food at the grocery store, right? You don't tax that. You don't tax prescription drugs. And the reason for that is keeping in mind these are things that people need to spend money on rather than discretionary decisions. So the idea of extending that logic to something like diapers you're not really forging like a brand new path. It's an extension of a logic that Maryland has already embraced, really.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there are other benefits to it too. I mean, from the local government perspective, doing tax relief through the sales tax sales tax is purely a state tax. So that doesn't have consequences for local budgets as, income tax changes or property tax changes would. So, I feel very good about what we propose. The bills all passed unanimously, as you might expect. Everybody was very excited to vote for them. So we'll have them on the floor next week and be able to have a good, robust debate, I hope.
Yeah, I think everybody who was in the room added themselves as a co-sponsor, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, bipartisan. I think everybody can support these things. And I think you're right. I mean, diapers and things that, hygiene products, things that people use every day, everybody has to use them. Makes a lot of sense to me. So while we're on the subject with tax policy, I want to bring up one more thing. It has to do with schools. How, we've talked a lot about the blueprint, and Kerwin is how we really got our start with this podcast and got a following. We sort of broke down Kerwin piece by piece in ways that people weren't doing. And, a few years ago, I think it was a few years ago, time is like stood still with COVID, but I remember I was in there in Ways and Means, and you made a quip, because often you have to always ask me a question I see your light turn on and I'm like, here it comes. He's got it. But you made a quip about, hey, Maryland is unique, right? Where most states, school boards have taxing authority in many states. County governments in Maryland are unique in the fact that we do handle a lot of funding for our schools. Our school boards don't have taxing authority. And you mentioned, hey, what would you think about if we were to give our school boards taxing authority and that they would then be responsible for funding schools? That was sort of, I think it was an interesting question. And we thought about it a lot. And I wanted to just get your perspective on how Maryland works based on other states that do give their school boards. It's sort of separate in terms of the ability to raise revenue to pay for schools.
Yeah. I mean, I asked that question at the time, sort of half jokingly and half also because, it is a real policy question that I think we should consider. Just because we've always done things the same way doesn't mean we need to keep doing that. For me, it's always been a little odd the way Maryland does things, because, you have a situation where in most counties, the elected members of the Board of Education are making spending decisions, but they're not accountable for raising the money that's necessary to fund the system. In most cases, it's the county, and the state does a lot to help. But really, if taxes are too high locally, it's the county councils and commissions that are bearing the brunt of that from taxpayers. So I've always thought it a little odd, so I've raised it over the years periodically with friends of mine on councils and commissions around the state, with you guys, and it's interesting. People always step back and say, that's an interesting question, but also there's a lot of inertia in terms of this is the way we do things now. Right. Why change things?
Right. I think in general, I think it's a healthy thing for policymakers to have that conversation every so often, to take a step back and say, maybe the way we've always done it isn't exactly right. I mean, one argument I think that is in favor of the way Maryland funds education is we're way less reliant on property taxes as the workhorse than Pennsylvania or New York or Ohio or other, the more conventional setting, because I grew up in the state of Ohio and my school district had a tax, but it was one tool. It was a property tax for the schools. And, back to regressivity and fairness in tax systems, the property tax is wrought with regressivity and other issues that make it really unpopular as well. So, there's probably no perfect solution there, but continuing to ask, do we have this right? I think it's a healthy thing.
I would agree.
That's what we're here for. That's what we're here for.
All right. So, Delegate, just to pivot a little bit, I want to talk about a bill that I know you're really excited about, and the Great Maryland Outdoors Act. And I want to talk about how we got there. But I heard something the other day when you were presenting testimony on this bill. You said it was a bill that you are the most proud of since the time that you've been a legislator. And that sort of stuck with me, because you've had a lot of bills, you've done a lot of things. But let's talk about this a little bit. How we got from all the way back during the pandemic, you were going around the state, right? You're visiting all these parks, and then COVID happens, and obviously people needed to get out. But this was a big undertaking, I think, to get from there to here. So I know you're really proud about this, and I want you to talk about it and tell people what this bill does and why it's so important.
Sure. So Maryland State Park System is more than 100 years old now, and it's fantastic. We have gorgeous parks. They were built largely in two eras, in the New Deal era by the Civilian Conservation Corps, and then in the 50s and 60s. But really, we've been under-investing in them for about 50 years now. We don't have enough parks. The parks we have are aging. A lot of the infrastructure that was built back in the New Deal era needs to be replaced. And we haven't been replacing it at a fast enough pace. We don't have nearly enough park rangers. The park rangers we have aren't paid enough, so they often leave the state ranger service to go work for local park systems or the National Park Service because they can make more money. So the parks have a lot of challenges to them. And what we saw during the pandemic was this incredible spike in visitation. Marylanders during the pandemic went outdoors more than ever, certainly in my lifetime, by the millions, literally the millions. So just to put some numbers on it, in 2010, there were about 10 million visitors in the state parks. Last year, there were about 20 million. So we doubled our visitorship in a decade. Almost the same number of parks. We've added just a couple, almost exactly the same number of rangers. So the system's under strain. And, when we started having these conversations after the last legislative session, myself, Senator Sarah Elfrith, the presiding officers, I didn't quite expect the amount of support we've seen. Marylanders love their parks. I've never seen so much excitement from people about a bill that I've been working on, because these are places that are iconic to people. They're places that they grew up going to, that they take their families to. And they're all over the state.
Right? Everybody has memories at parks. Right.
Yeah, I mean, look, for people like me that grew up in Maryland, I remember going to Assateague State Park as a kid. I remember going out on the boats on Clopper Lake. I remember going to Deep Creek. Like this is Maryland, right? So, given that level of support, given the tremendous support from the presiding officers, the leadership that Governor Paris Glendening, who chaired the State Park Investment Commission for us, given all of that support, we've been able to craft a bill that I described in that same hearing as a moonshot for Maryland state parks, and it really is. It's the largest single investment in our state parks in state history. It'll create new state parks. It'll restore our older state parks. It'll significantly increase the size of the ranger service. It'll commit our parks to being more accessible to people that use transit, people with disabilities, all sorts of groups of Marylanders. So I think the bill, it passed the first Senate committee hurdle earlier this week in the Budget and Tax Committee unanimously. I think this is going to be one of the highlights of the legislative session in terms of good, solid bipartisan work for the people of Maryland.
And leaving behind a big footprint, right? If we end up making a sort of generational investment in recreational opportunities for Marylanders everywhere. And you've undersold the components of the bill to some degree. I mean, there's pieces in there about, accessibility and equity, as well as just the breadth of offerings and making sure there's space for everybody to enjoy parks. We want to be able to get people there and make broad opportunities and so forth. So this is one of those things that, we could be looking back on. That old story. Well, when was the best time to plant the tree? It's like 30 years ago. Like 30 years from now, we could be saying, thank God they did something like this back when they did. And that could be a really good thing.
Yeah, I was serious when I said that. I think the thing I'm most proud of working on. I think this is a game changer for a lot of folks. And, for a lot of Maryland families, the parks are where you recreate because you can't necessarily afford to spend tons of money every weekend to go out. And you see that. I mean, you go out to any park in Maryland on the weekend and it's people with their families. It's, and these are places that are good for us and good for the soul, good for your health. And so, yeah, I think it's an extraordinarily well-designed bill. I take no credit for that. That goes to Governor Glendening and Senator Elfreth and the DLS staff who helped write it. I'm glad that it's become a bipartisan thing. And, I think we'll see a number of new parks open over the next few years because of it. And I'll just give you one example of what I mean by this underinvestment, what we're trying to fix. There's a state park that most people have never heard of. It's called Fort Tenalloway State Park. It's out in Hancock, Maryland, right? And people who don't know where Hancock is, it's where Maryland gets really skinny out west. So Fort Tenalloway was an early fort built during the French and Indian War to protect Maryland settlers who were on the frontier from attack by the French. And so it's a historic site, and it was designated as a state park decades ago. Well, in the early 80s, Maryland had a budget crisis. And in 1982, we closed Fort Tenalloway State Park, and it's still closed 40 years later. And you talk to folks in Hancock, and they're just baffled. Why would we have this gorgeous piece of land right next to the C&O Canal, right next to the Western Maryland Rail Trail, right next to the town of Hancock, right behind the high school? Why just leave it empty, doing nothing, right? Literally closed off. So, places like Fort Tenalloway, that's what it's about. And, the next generation of Marylanders will be able to go out and enjoy these places.
Plus, it helps with our you never want to take your eyes completely off the French. I'm just saying, it may have been dozens and dozens of fiscal years since we've had to dust up with them, but let's not lose sight of the whole game here.
Yeah, I think we have to be cautious. I mean, the French and also Ohio. You worry about Ohio sometimes, so
that's fair too.
All the time. No, parks are certainly important to counties, and the General Assembly, I must say, there's been a massive investment, mostly through the capital budget, and last year, and I think this year again, in our parks. So that's certainly important to counties. And this bill, I agree, it's a great piece of legislation, but I'm really a big fan of bringing all the people to the table to get a big thing done. And I like the fact that literally you watch this unfold where you're running around visiting all the parks and you're on Twitter. And then we started to see, you're right, like all the parks had to close every day because they were just at capacity. And I know you would always quip about that and retweet that and say, look, we got to do something. So you get the commission together, everybody gets around the table, they come up with this idea, and now it turns into a bill. So, I'm always a big fan of the process, but bringing all the right people to the table is the way to get a big thing done. And that's exactly what happened here. So hats off to you. I agree. It seems like a great bill and it's a great investment. And that your story about what's going on in Hancock, that's pretty, I didn't know about that. So thank you for that. That's pretty fascinating actually. And they'll be able, I assume, to open back up.
Yeah. That's the hope. They're doing there's one more step. They're doing a historical study to see if they can find the location of the old fort. But yeah, I think in the next couple of years.
Okay, so parks, big deal. We'll put a link in the show notes for that bill and for the testimony there. But let's pivot again to some just off the wall interesting stuff. So, Michael, I'll let you be the lead on this issue because you're really the driver here, and you put this into my head. So let's talk about the quirky budget issue that has now been resolved. But there's a bigger issue here, right, Michael?
So, I think so, and maybe not many people join me in finding this a fascinating little question mark or asterisk in our structure of government in Maryland. But as you know, Delegate, when the governor proposed his budget this year, there were some people saying, wait, there's not as much education funding as we had thought was coming through the Kerwin Blueprint program. And we ended up with sort of a difference of opinion over whether a piece of that education funding was truly mandated. And there's a tale on this that goes back a decade or so, that are actually longer than that. But the idea of the General Assembly can mandate governors to fund things in the budget, but if it's not airtight, then maybe it doesn't have the holding of law. So we had a few weeks of wondering how this was going to play out. And just this week, Governor Hogan came through with a supplemental budget. He has the ability to say, in addition to what I've submitted, here's some extra things, either moving money around or adding and so forth. And he came through with that extra education money. So I think it probably moots the issue for the moment. But since you're the navel gazer type, I want to engage you on this because I think it's really interesting. What might have happened if we had? What if this governor stuck to his guns and said, I never had to fund that? I don't care what letter you get from the attorney general. I didn't have to fund it. And what if the session just ended? The funding never happened. Would we have suddenly created sort of a weird new, would we have the 2022 law people will be talking for 20 and 40 years around? Well, apparently it doesn't really bind the governor's hands. If the governor can find some politically salient argument, some future governor could just say, well, I don't need to fund libraries or whatever. Do you see what I'm talking about as a potential hole in the boat that could have come from this session?
Yeah, I mean, I think, though, ultimately, had the governor not seen the light and provided that additional funding, I think it was like $99 million for the city of Baltimore, right, and 20 or 30 for Prince George's County. Right. I think it would have ended up in court. I think, the Court of Appeals eventually would have weighed in. And look, we saw that to some extent with the debate last year over unemployment insurance benefits and, the case that was brought saying the governor had to push the federal benefits through to Marylanders, and the court eventually agreed that the governor was bound by law. So, but I do think in the case of mandates like this, it becomes, after this year, a much less significant conversation, because as the legislature takes over more budget authority, there's a lot less reason for us to do budget mandates in the first place, right? Because we'll have more influence over the budget itself. So I think there will not only be fewer budget mandates, I think we'll start to see some movement over the next decade or so in the removal of existing budget mandates and a reversion to a more traditional appropriations process like most states and the federal government have.
And I guess that would be a natural follow through with the question that was put before Maryland voters and they approved, to give the legislature some more authority in the budget process that most states' legislatures have, then to potentially have Maryland statute back off a little bit in some regards on these mandates. What might be the natural balancing that would make some degree of sense here. So that wouldn't be an unreasonable way for this to play out, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. It'll be interesting. And of course, there's a lot of stakeholder groups and advocacy groups that like the mandates, right? They like some assurance that they're going to get funding. So, I'm kind of fascinated to see how everything plays out with that transition in the budget.
Yeah, counties are certainly one of those groups. I mean, we've talked about the fact that usually we see a BRFA, right? And that's the bill that accompanies the budget that sort of makes things work, especially when you're in tough fiscal times. This year, it looks like we're not going to need one, but that's where typically we would see those mandated formulas, proposals to cut those formulas, and we'll show up and say, wait, keep the community college funding in place, don't cut the disparity grants. So I am interested with those mandates potentially going away, you do lose some of that certainty, but it is a push and pull. And I think it's sort of a fair deal, if you will, with what the voters approved. But yeah, it's interesting. So maybe this is null and void at this point, but it sounds like, the only thing you could do if the governor did stick to his guns was go to court. So that would have been interesting. But as we mentioned, the governor did introduce a supplemental budget, which among other things included that funding that everybody seemed to think was there. So interesting stuff for sure, but we'll see. And on this, again, one of the other quirky things that we really hate this term of local aid, right? And this is something that shows up in all the budget presentations and the documents. And it's like, wow, local governments, with property tax and being number one, I think number two, they always like to say, is aid from the state. And it seems, if you were just perusing through those documents, wow, counties, municipalities, they are loaded with cash, right? They got money out the yin yang. And why is my property tax rate what it is? And why can't they just, why can't they cut everything? Look at all this money that the state gives them. But the reality is that most of this, almost, I think like 86 or close to 90% of it, goes directly to schools. So the county government doesn't even touch the money, goes directly to schools. And look, we agree that the state does a lot to help schools, and that's a good thing. But can't we change that term, Delegate? Can't we say that is like education aid and get that out of this general local aid category, which makes us all look rich?
You all were talking up the position of majority leader earlier, but I will say to you that this is one of those things that is entirely within the purview of the truly brilliant people in the Department of Legislative Services. I get the argument, and it's interesting because every state has a different relationship between the state government and the localities, right? And to some extent, one of the reasons that Maryland provides a lot of local education aid is that we limit some of the taxing authority of our local governments, right? Our school boards don't have any. Counties can't do sales taxes. We cap the income taxes. So, there's a reason for that. I get the argument. But ultimately, I think nobody likes paying taxes, right? So, I think whatever you call it, you'll still get some complaints.
Yeah. I just feel like for you and your colleagues, you get these reports from the very, very capable staff, and they say, like, where do your tax dollars go, right? There's always like a pie chart like that. And then when something like 42 cents out of the entire pie chart is going to aid to local governments, you can't tell your residents back home in the district, boy, I really delivered because I gave aid to local governments. It would just seem to benefit everybody to be able to say, look, like 38 cents out of every dollar is going right into education. You're with me. You love education just like I do. It just seems like it would roll off the tongue better. And then a tiny little sliver for, a little money goes for those local parks and for the local police departments and libraries and whatnot. But anyway, this is our little cause celeb over here. So.
Yeah, look, I think you underestimate the ability of politicians to phrase things in ways that are helpful. So trust me, I don't go home to my constituents and say, we sent a lot of local aid to Montgomery County. I say, we built some schools and put money in the classroom, and we funded highway user revenues. So.
Wow.
That's how it's going to be this year. I like it. All right.
I like it. All right. That's we love highway users. So there are paths forward, Delegate. There are. We've talked about them. We can do it. And one more thing, I think you sort of agree with us here, and I think most people would agree. Constant yield, and I'll put a link in the show notes for this, exactly what it is, but it's this ridiculous requirement that no one understands. And we have to put an ad in the newspaper that essentially says, counties are raising taxes. Even if we're not raising taxes, we may even lower the tax rate. But if the assessor comes in and property values rise and the county's going to bring in more than it did from the previous year, just because those assessments went up, you have to put an ad in the newspaper, prescriptive in terms of the font size, and it's nuts, and it's in complete legalese. And again, counties are raising taxes when they are not raising taxes. The reality is assessments went up. So there are several bills this year, and I know the Ways and Means Committee has them, Budget and Tax has them. Ways and Means seems to have a path forward here to move in the right direction. But what this law is on the books, it's been on the books for years and years and years. And I've never met anyone who can read that, who's not a lawyer, and not think that the county's going to raise my taxes, so I'm going to show up with a pitchfork and I'm going to raise hell. because they're not raising my taxes. And then they show up and it's like, oh, you're not raising taxes, but oh, my assessment went up. So like Delegate, what can we do here? Because I think you called them in the hearing, this is really dumb, right? This is dumb. It's a dumb requirement.
Yeah, no, it is. It is. I mean, anytime you have a state law that specifies the font size you have to use for something, it's dumb, right? I was a middle school teacher. I used to teach this lesson on stupid laws all the time. This is a stupid law. And it's not a bad thing to educate taxpayers about what's happening with taxes. In fact, that's important. We need taxpayers to understand that. But this law confuses taxpayers. It actively confuses them. And so I think it needs a complete overhaul. And we need to look at it in a different way. If only just, this is me being a nerdy, like economics tax guy, if only because it doesn't consider inflation at all, right? I mean, so you're saying your taxes are going up, but really you're inflating, right? So I think it needs a total overhaul. What that ends up looking like, whether it happens this session, I don't know. But I know it's been a huge pain in the rear end to a lot of local governments for a very long time.
Yeah. And no one wants to look like you're anti-transparency. Right. Like we have to tell people this is what the budget looks like. These are the proposed tax rates. These are the things that we're suggesting are going to change. We're going to invest more money here, and it's going to cost you in this tax. Like all that stuff had darn well better be transparent, and everybody should have their chance to show up and be happy or be unhappy and say so. But it really is a disappointing thing. Almost every jurisdiction every year has to hold this meeting, and they put something in the paper that says notice of tax increase. And a poor dozen people show up thinking that, this is my chance to give them a piece of my mind. And then they hear what's going on. They're like, oh, this really wasn't the show after all. So maybe that will come. Yeah.
Transparency is good. This ain't it.
Yeah.
Agree. All right. So before we let you go, one more thing that I'm going to add here, cannabis. Obviously a huge discussion this year, a lot of movement, this several years in the making. I just want to get your take. I know that the House is moving 2 bills. The Senate may have some different ideas, but there really are 2 options on the table here, right? One of them is for a long time, states always put this on the ballot, right? And then we had a few states just pass a bill. And I think that sort of people were looking around saying, hey, we could do it that way. But what are your thoughts here? It looks like the House wants to put this before the voters on the ballot. And just talk about the rationale there. And I think, it's always probably good to get buy-in, particularly on an issue like this. There are so many things. It's not just about legalizing adult use. There are a lot of equity issues and things that have to be considered. How do you tax it? So what are your thoughts? I mean, again, you're moving bills. But how do you see this playing out when it comes to cannabis and what Maryland's going to do moving forward?
I think we will end up likely putting it on the ballot. I think that's what we should do, not just because, of democracy, right? People should have their say, but also because it helps to solidify the conversation. If we just legalize it and it's not on the ballot, then people will keep debating sort of the fundamentals of the issue, right? Should it be legal or not, and not be able to focus on the details of it. And so, back in 2008, when we legalized casino gambling, I mean, it was a similar thing. When the voters approved casino gambling, like that question was settled. That was done. And we could move on to the conversations we've been having for the last, 14 years about how exactly to make it happen in Maryland. So right. I think we likely end up on the ballot. The House is in a position of not wanting to move forward with the full structure of the industry and regulation. Part of the reason for that is equity. We feel it's very important, given that the drug war was disproportionately targeted at lower income and minority communities, that we create opportunities for lower income and minority business owners to participate in the industry. In order to do that, we have to do something called a disparity study. That takes time. So essentially our proposal is let's put it on the ballot. Let's do some basic criminal justice adjustments immediately and do that disparity study. And then next year we'll come back with the disparity study and be able to do all the detail work. And there's a lot of that detail work to do, right? I mean, who gets a license, where the license located, what happens with the revenue, what are the tax rates, how do you deal with driving under the influence? There's tons of details to legalizing cannabis.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and the Senate may have different ideas, and that's often the case. And the House and the Senate will come together and figure something out. But yeah, a lot of moving parts, big deal. And I think, like you said, I think that those two bills have already passed second reader in the House, so they're on the way to getting out. A lot of debate, obviously, back and forth, but that makes a lot of sense in terms of why you do that. I think there is also the question of, if you put it on the ballot, it becomes a constitutional amendment. We know, particularly with casinos and with gambling, if you put it into the Constitution, you have to, if you want to tweak it, that becomes more work. So is there do you have any thoughts on, if we do this, then we're really enshrining it, and it's going to be a lot harder to make changes down the road if we need to do that.
Yeah, luckily we learned from past experience. So when we legalized casinos, one of the mistakes we made was that the referendum, the constitutional language, actually specified the number of casinos in the Constitution, right? So when, we had to come back when we authorized MGM Grand to open at National Harbor, and we had to come back when we wanted to authorize sports betting, because that was a new type of gambling, right? With cannabis, the question we're putting on the ballot is pretty straightforward. It's, should it be legal, yes or no? And if you say yes, it should be legal, the General Assembly will create a regulatory structure. So we won't have to keep coming back to the ballot this time. We learned from our previous mistake.
Yep. So keeping it pretty generic is that's on purpose.
I've got one last question for the delegate. I mean, we've covered lots of ground. So my question is, what do you call a beehive without an exit? Unbelievable.
Oh, no, that's terrible. That's terrible.
We had to get a dad joke in there.
Everything.
I love it, though. I love it. It makes me
elements.
I will tell you, I will look up dad jokes just to spring them on my kids at the dinner table, just to elicit that groan. I love it.
No, it's like, what if, we are just those people now. I guess all of us are. So it's pretty sad when that makes your day, but here we are. All right. Well, Delegate Luedtke, really appreciate you coming on. I know you're busy. It's been a long day, but we really, really appreciate you being here. I thought it was a great conversation, and I'm sure our listeners are going to enjoy it. We will link up all of these conversations that we've had, any relevant links, but anything on your mind before we let you go, Delegate Luedtke, anything we missed?
No, just appreciate you guys. And I appreciate this podcast. There aren't many sources of information and news that go deep into policy issues. I think you guys do a great job with this. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So we'll leave it there. If you enjoy the podcast, please go ahead and subscribe. That way, all of these episodes will be sent directly to the device of your choice. You can also follow along on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and then, of course, the Conduit Street blog. But for Delegate Eric Luedtke, Michael Sanderson, this is Kevin Kinnally signing off, and we will talk to you soon.